This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is March 27th, 2022. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Christina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
We have three interesting segments for you this week. Darren is going to give us his thoughts on the book Intellectuals and Society by Thomas Sowell. Adam gives us a segment about domestication syndrome. But first, Christina, you're going to talk to us about making donations during disasters.
Yes, I am. A few years ago, Darren did a deep dive into whether canned food drives are as good as they sound. And spoiler, his conclusion was that canned food drives are pretty inefficient in comparison to donating money directly to an organization. I guess we're starting to sound like a broken record, but this is the running theme, right, Pat?
Exactly.
Dale Herzog is the Humanitarian Logistics Director at UPS. For those who are not familiar, that's the United Parcel Service, an American multinational shipping and receiving and supply chain management company. He has been deployed several times to areas to manage logistics after natural disasters or other tragedies. And then some of these include the 2016 Louisiana floods, Hurricanes Harvey, Matthew, and Joaquin. I'm Portuguese, so that's how I pronounce that. His focus over the last decade plus has been to help improve processes and data visibility for NGOs worldwide. Herzog did a TED Talk on the dark side of charitable donation, and man, talk about giving us a reality check. So this is what I'm going to dig into today. In a video in his companion article, which I link to in our show notes, Herzog essentially describes the mayhem caused by unsolicited and, as he stresses, mostly unwanted gifts and donations that flood areas in the wake of natural disasters and tragedies. Most people have the best of intentions, right? But often their generosity has the opposite effect. It actually slows down relief efforts. Unwanted donations clog warehouses and airport tarmacs, shelters. They create a huge burden to volunteers on the ground and regrettably often end up being destroyed. Now, a little side note. We live in an area that has a sizable Ukrainian population. In fact, Toronto's Ukrainian Festival, a joyous yearly event, happens in our greater neighborhood. So the invasion of Ukraine is particularly deeply felt in our community. In light of the horrific situation and suffering in Ukraine, I'm seeing a lot of calls for donations for stuff. So when Adam posted Herzog's TED Talk in our group chat, I felt it was pretty timely to cover it. Okay, before you feel compelled to send stuff to areas experiencing natural or humanitarian disasters, Herzog shares some valuable advice and the three important questions we should ask ourselves first. 1. Is this stuff wanted? Herzog says, please note the distinction between the word wanted and needed. In short, after a natural disaster, let the organizations working to give aid to people who have lost everything. Time to prioritize what is actually needed. 2. How will this stuff get there? 3. How will the stuff get distributed after it arrives at its destination? Herzog kicks off his talk relaying what happened after the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Connecticut. For those unaware, the incident is considered the deadliest mass shooting at an elementary school in U.S. history. As reported, the horrific massacre was at the hands of a 20-year-old man who shot and killed 26 people. 20 were children between 6 and 7 years old, and 6 were adult staff. Actually, 27 people if you count the killer's mother, who he shot at her home before heading to the school. Now, Herzog recounts the outpouring of stuff sent to the town, whose population is, I looked it up, currently around 11,000. Thousands of boxes flooded nearby Newton, a population of 27,000. Christmas toys, school supplies, clothing, gifts, over 500,000 cards, letters, paper snowflakes. I'm not sure if that was a thing. Maybe that was a thing at the time. Around 65,000 stuffed teddy bears.
For a population of how many people?
11,000.
Wow.
And more than 1,000 of the teddy bears were life-sized. I can't wrap my head around what people were thinking sending life-size teddy bears. I don't mean to be a jerk. I know people were well-meaning, but come on. Of course, as Herzog says, this was a tremendous gesture of love from people around the world. The logistical challenges presented by this deluge, however, was tremendously bad. A community in the midst of trying to process an unthinkable tragedy has to now navigate an avalanche of unwanted donations that at one point occupied 80,000 square feet, standing 8 feet high.
Wow.
EMS, police, firefighters, and volunteers from neighboring post offices had to be brought in to manage it all. Now, Darren has mentioned this a bajillion times during his segments about effective altruism and donating. It's understandable that people watching things unfold are overcome with grief and empathy and concern. Many people are compelled to, quote unquote, do something. Feeling like you're doing something can make you feel better. I don't know, perhaps it helps you reconcile your feelings of helplessness. Herzog says that often this results in people sending, quote, household stuff. He's referring to the stuff we accumulate in our garages, basements, closets, attics. I think he was too nice to say old crap, actually. Another unfortunate thing, some business organizations see these tragedies as golden opportunities. Companies can unload old inventory, get a nice tax break, and brownie points to boot for their seemingly altruistic act. Now, here's an example that had my jaw on the floor. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, a company sent 10 shipping containers filled with hundreds of fridges. Oh. Can you see a problem with that, Pat?
Yeah, they didn't have any electricity.
Yeah. Most survivors were living in tents with no electricity. Icing on the cake, none of the fridge's wiring was actually compatible in the country. So there's that too. Here is a short list of head-scratching donations after the earthquake. Winter clothes. The average temperature in Haiti is 22 to 34 degrees Celsius, or around 73 to 94 degrees. It's a tropical island. Potato chips, energy drinks. Are you ready for this one? Tuxedos.
No.
Yeah. All this and more is documented in a report titled Unsolicited In-Kind Donations and Other Inappropriate Humanitarian Goods from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Another example, after Hurricane Harvey, which struck Houston in 2017, a retailer donated 40,000 ladies' belts. I'm sure you can agree that beltlessness wasn't their biggest problem at the time. Now, other collateral damage of unsolicited donations is the effect on the environment. After Haiti's earthquake and the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan, authorities reported that 60% of all the donations were dumped in landfills because they were simply not needed. And then add to that the carbon footprint, of course, shipping all of this stuff, right? Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into everything Herzog covers, like how outside emergency relief could potentially harm the local economy. For example, after Hurricane Matthew, local retailers expressed that they wished relief organizations had contacted them first. As we've heard again and again, including on TRC, monetary donations remain the most effective and efficient way to help. As Herzog says, disaster response is fluid, reacting to whatever is needed in the moment, and needs can change on a dime. Money allows the flexibility for reputable organizations to get the right stuff and get it in bulk and also locally, if possible. Now, as for cards, letters, teddy bears, that may seem an appropriate thing, but Herzog suggests a virtual message is a much better way for you to express your heartfelt wishes and support.
I think in Darren's segment on canned food drives, it was I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was for every can of soup that you go to the store and buy and donate, if you gave them the money, they could buy 4. Mm-hmm. Plus, it needs to get to them.
Yes. Yeah. Now, here's something really cool, Pat. Herzog is working with reps from over 20 organizations to determine their mutual needs and taking that info to design a donor management system, which they call DMS. He likens it to a gift registry for disasters. So this way, retailers can bundle donor purchases and report back to organizations. So at the time of his TED Talk, he mentioned it would be ready by the end of 2018. So I gave it a Goog to see what the status is, and it looks like it's up and running. I linked to it in our show notes. So just to elaborate a little bit on that, for instance, a retailer can see that they're getting a lot of requests for a certain thing. They can reach out through this system and say, hey, we can give you 2 pallets of this because we're seeing that this is needed in this area. I'm simplifying it, of course, but it sounds like a really cool initiative.
So they don't end up with everyone donating the same thing.
Yeah, and people shipping it from everywhere.
Right.
And when I asked Darren if there was anything he wanted to add, since this topic falls right into his field of interest and expertise, he mentioned to make sure I highlight how donors have a responsibility to think through their actions. My reply to Darren was, "You mean think better to act better?"
Nice.
Stay classy and not smart-assy, everyone.
Thanks, Christina. And with that, we'll turn things over to Adam and Darren. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you again soon.
What's up, cuboids? Animal domestication is an interesting thing, which has occurred many times throughout the last 50,000 years or so, and which I've covered on the show many times over the last dozen years or so. One aspect of this, which I covered in episode 58, that's back in 2009, is the domestic silver fox. So some new research has called those results into question, and I thought it was worth covering. To put it simply, there have been a lot of varying domesticated species over the years. These were not usually done in a particularly controlled way, but in different ways which we don't always already know all of the specific details about. The idea of these domesticated silver foxes was that they were bred for one trait and one trait alone, that is tameness, and as a result, over a very short amount of time, they developed a bunch of other traits that are often seen with other animal domestication examples. So what's the twist? Well, they were already domesticated when the experiment started, and they already exhibited a lot of the traits which were said to have been produced by that domestication experiment. The bulk of my updated analysis of the silver fox issue is from a paper, "The History of Farm Foxes Undermines the Animal Domestication Syndrome," from the journal Trends in Ecology and Evolution. The phenomenon being studied here is referred to as domestication syndrome, and the concept existed long before the silver fox experiment did. So while that particular experiment being called into question also brings the concept of domestication syndrome into question, that was never relied on solely as the reason. So these foxes alone do not discredit the idea completely. Charles Darwin described the concept, though it grew in popularity after the whole fox thing made a big deal. So there's basically a cluster of traits which occur in various animal species as they get domesticated. So oddly, although many domesticated species experience an overlap of these traits, none of these are possessed by all domesticated species, and no single domesticated species has all of these traits either. So we can't say, for example, all domesticated animals have floppy ears, curly tails, big patches of color. The most commonly seen traits in domesticated species are coat color, 80%, different brain sizes, 70%, jaw length, 70%. So domestic animals are usually more tame. That's kind of the point. They often lose reproductive seasonality. They can have changes in the color of their coat, and the shape of their ears, tails, shape of their faces, right? So like I said, it's not usually one of these, but a few at a time. It varies. So the basic assumption, which was the impression I had when I first discussed this topic on the show, was that this experiment began with wild foxes. Now, the whole thing occurred over only 40 years, of which time the selective breeding took place. It's produced, as the New York Times called it in 1999, a new and once undreamed of breed of fox, one that whines for attention from human beings without any prior conditioning, licks its master's faces, and has even begun to look something like a domestic dog. Incredible if true. So the purpose of the project was to only select on tameness and nothing else to see if those other traits which occurred from other domesticated species would follow, right? So is it a byproduct of them being tamed, or are those other traits being selected for when animals are domesticated, or is it kind of a mix, right? This is what they're kind of trying to evaluate with this experiment. So it started with a small pool of only 30 male and 100 female foxes. They were said to be from a fur farm in Estonia. As the story goes, they singled out 5% of the tamest animals per generation for further breeding. And it's said that they did in 40 years what usually takes thousands. The new paper suggests that these foxes started with a population from Prince Edward Island in Canada, which had been captive and bred to encourage certain behaviors since 1887. Wild foxes had proved difficult to breed in captivity, so they started with a breeding pair in 1883. They started their farm in 1887. They were selected for appearance and behavior. The farm was operated by Charles Dalton, who preferred black foxes, and Robert Ulton, who preferred white stripes. So they were not bred specifically to be docile, but that may have manifested as a byproduct of other traits, or just, because of the fact that the more misbehaved ones might have been selected out for other reasons. So in 1928, a breeding pair of Canadian foxes were used to establish a Russian fur farm, which was the ancestor of the foxes used in the domestic silver fox experiment. So it kind of goes back to that farm in Prince Edward Island. DNA analysis suggests that the foxes did indeed descend from Eastern Canadian foxes from fur farms. The changes in the domestic silver foxes are more comparable to changes which were observed from selective breeding of a domestic dog than to an actual wild wolf, right? So dog species have changed a lot, say, over the last 100 years, and that's not the same as sort of something being bred from a wild animal. So this fact does not, on its own, completely disprove the idea of domestication syndrome, but that is often used as a big reason to support its existence, and that main reason doesn't really exist anymore. So you have to, take the rest of the evidence on its own. The study examined many traits which are often said to be associated with domestic syndrome, looked at data showing whether or not they are linked to tameness. So the results was that many of these traits were not correlated to tameness specifically. For example, there's tooth shape and craniofacial morphology, so basically the shape of the skull, shape of teeth. So while domesticated dogs, pigs, and goats have shorter muzzles, domesticated cat skulls don't really differ in shape from wild cats. And even within dogs, the shape of the skull varies a lot between breeds. You've got some with the long muzzle, you've got some with the short snout. Tail shape doesn't really tell us much for dogs. There are different shapes depending on the different breeds. Silver foxes had about 10% with curved tails, but that didn't seem to correlate specifically with tameness. So the foxes with the curved tails weren't more tame than the foxes that didn't have curved tails. Coat color, that's a common one, and these results are mixed. So cats and dogs have depigmentation, so white spotting, and color variations are more common in domesticated cats and dogs compared to their wild counterparts. You see these wild animals, they blend in more with nature. You think of a pet, you wouldn't be able to hide that in a forest very easily. Rabbits had common color variation for domesticated rabbits, but these variations were rare in wild rabbits. Same idea. The foxes tell us nothing here since fur-farmed foxes were already selected specifically for their coat color. So we can't say these wild foxes over 40 years got all these weird colors. They came from fur farms. They were farmed for fur. Ear shape is another that's fairly common with some dogs, cats, goats, pigs, and rabbits. So they have changes in their ears, usually floppy ears. And seasonality is a mixed one. So this relates to when animals will mate. Wild animals will usually mate seasonally, while domesticated animals will mate on a different schedule. You can often breed them more than once a year, things like that. In some cases, like with dogs, this is a genetic change in the domesticated animal. However, for other species, it's an environmental change, meaning that their mating cycle will be different in captivity. But if those animals are released in the wild, they will revert to their original cycles. This can often relate to the availability or scarcity of resources. For example, an animal knows that it's time to breed when there's an abundance of food or a lack of food and things like this. For foxes, the domestic foxes were often bred twice a year, in contrast to the once a year in wild foxes. But the pups from the second breeding cycle usually didn't survive, including those from the domesticated silver fox experiment. So that doesn't really tell us anything. Brain size is another factor often cited, but there was no conclusive evidence with smaller brain size in domesticated animals. So dogs have smaller brains compared to wolves, but it seems likely that domesticated dogs descended from a different species than the wild wolves that we know of today. Domesticated pigs were the only animals shown to have a consistently smaller brain size, so no differences in brain size were observed in the domestic silver foxes. Ultimately, the examples given in the paper often ended up saying that they didn't have data for certain other animals, so there may be more examples than those that are given, and there may actually sort of be more clustering examples of these than the paper showed. It neither conclusively proves or disproves the validity of this concept. Domestication syndrome was not an idea which originated from the domestic silver fox experiment. It was first put forth by Charles Darwin, who noted certain similarities in domesticated species. We should consider these merits on their own, and while the domesticated silver fox experiment seemed to show good support for this idea, that example itself does not seem to be the silver bullet it once seemed to be. There are a number of phenotypic traits which will occur in domesticated organisms, some of which are more or less common and almost none of which appear in all examples. The exact reason for any of these changes needs to be considered on their own, and then we can see whether they reoccur in different species and what may be the reason for that. Simply put, tameness on its own has not been conclusively proven to be the sole factor which, when selected for, can explain other traits described by domestication syndrome. More research needs to be done for sure. Peace out, cuboids.
I'm going to do a short book review on Intellectuals and Society by Thomas Sowell. Intellectuals and Society is not a good book, but at least it's long. Ugh. I've read several of Sowell's books, and this seems to be Sowell at his worst. Insufficiently rigorous, ranty, and biased. As such, it was primarily an exercise in perspective-taking, for I had to do a lot of mental work, applying the principle of charity, to think about what the best version of his argument was, and then evaluate that instead of what he wrote and how he presented it. It is correct that many public intellectuals speak on issues of which they are ignorant. They get attention for saying flashy things without much accountability, and are often disconnected from the experiences of those that they speak for. These are good points he's made, and I agree with them. And we've even talked before about how, at least for forecasters that you see in the public eye, it's often inversely proportional, their accuracy and their fame. But in Sowell's presentation, this seems to be only a problem of people on the left. And while it is useful to be more exposed to his, or in general, actually, libertarian and right-leaning views, the staggering lack of balance in this book was a consistent frustration. One of Sowell's key points is the problem of intellectuals going beyond the bounds of their competence or expertise. I agree that this is a huge problem. Misinformation abounds, people spread information from, lay people all the way up to people who are supposedly more educated or have some experience, but people often want to pontificate or whatever crosses their feed, so that's a huge problem. As for intellectuals, they should kind of know better, but they often don't, or they're human just like the rest of us. So this is a problem, but exactly how and by whom this so-called domain of expertise is determined is unclear. It seems to be partly about credentialism in Sowell's eyes, but perhaps more strongly, I detected an undercurrent of if I disagree with their opinions, therefore they don't have expertise in that area. And this is not at all how you want to organize a book and argue logically. It's poor form to cherry-pick clearly flawed statements from 80 to 90 years ago from leftists that thought we didn't really need to fight the Nazis. Of course they were wrong. Of the totality of all the things they said, is that really representative? Maybe, maybe not. Was there anyone on the right who ever said anything wrong? Probably. All that to say, I thought that was poor, but it's even worse to argue that Chomsky was going beyond his expertise when Chomsky was criticizing the Vietnam War. Yes, Chomsky was formally trained in linguistics, but he has read so much and written so much about other issues, I would say he becomes an expert in that domain. Otherwise, what do the words mean? Just who gets to decide? Anyway, it was very annoying. And while Sowell may rely upon facts more than some public intellectuals, he didn't come off as trustworthy in this particular book, and also seemed to be hypocritically speaking beyond his expertise. Oof. So he's talking about war and greater public policy and so on, but he's an economist, so what should he be talking about, really? Then you could say, he was arguing for specific facts, criticizing other people outside their domain. Okay, sure, but that means that intellectuals can speak outside their domain. Who decides? Same issues I mentioned before. Round and round it goes. Now, of course, though, there are still some good parts of a 400-page book. How could there not be? And one of them is to remind yourself to challenge headlines or commentary you see in the news and seek out data and facts, even when issues are polarized and when large chunks of society have begun to engage in a sort of groupthink. For example, he'll say intellectuals hear about, say, some police officer shooting someone 7 times, and they'll think, that's too many times. How could they possibly shoot them that many times? You only need one bullet to kill someone. And he would say, well, it's not actually that easy. If you look at data in close proximity, when people fire many rounds, they don't all hit the target. And when people are further away, it's very hard to hit targets. And beyond that, has anyone ever fired guns or done this sort of thing? And he's like, I actually taught this when I was in the Marines. So that's a great example of something just sounds like it's wrong. People then think it's wrong. They argue that it's wrong when they often haven't done any evidence to support it. So that's a good example. The other one he's often mentioned in other books, which I think are better, like Economic Facts and Fallacies, is don't take any disparity as obviously necessarily evidence of discrimination. Perhaps there's discrimination involved, perhaps there wasn't. Just because two things are unequal doesn't mean there may not be a variety of reasons why they are. So be cautious of the fallacy of personal incredulity and embrace notions of cognitive humility. This is great, this is what we argue for on the show, and Sowell could use a reminder of this as well. Until next time, think better to act better.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.